There's no other way to really put it. Rolex's Milgauss collection is an enigma. It's an enigma because, judging by the current lineup, it's a watch that just doesn't fit in. It doesn't feel like it's a part of the family at all. And how this watch has managed to survive is a good subject, a good question to ask. And there are many different factors that I think lead into this watch and its importance in the so-called hierarchy of Rolex sports models. So let's look into it. There are two watches in Rolex's sports watch collection that have managed to skate by the decades virtually unharmed, unaffected by the myriad of discontinuations and sacrifices and removals, and that is the Air King and the Milgauss. These two watches now, if we look at the modern landscape, are in a way inextricably linked, especially when we refer to the earlier references that shared the same cases, shared the same finishing, and in fact were virtually the same watch, barring one detail, of course, the inner cage of the Milgauss, to aid in its anti-magnetic properties. Both of these watches, though they originated with oyster cases, had quite a divergent history. One piece that was handed out almost ceremoniously to the RAF in the 1950s, and another piece, also introduced in the 1950s, that was aimed at being a scientific instrument, a time of discovery where magnetism was a big issue affecting watch wearers. The Air King being the pilot's watch, the Milgauss being the engineer's watch. The fact still remains that if we step back and look at this holistically, neither of these watches should exist in the current Rolex sports lineup. These two watches are so peculiar, they don't line up with anything truly relevant in today's circumstance. You want a pilot watch, you get a GMT. It's a great traveler watch. You can get a Sky Dweller, same kind of thing. You can look at the IWC Mark 20, another great piece. So many other options. You want an anti-magnetic watch. Get an Aquaterra, get any modern sports watch today, and you'll see that it has a silicone hairspring and negates the effect of a magnet pulling the spring, throwing it out of course, affecting the timing and the accuracy of your watch. How has the Air King survived? That's a subject for another time. How has the Milgauss survived? I think it has unquestionably the coolest name of a sports watch in Rolex's family. Maybe besides the Submariner. The name Milgauss, it evokes this sense of wonder, mysticism. It just sounds fantastic. It rolls off the tongue so well. And for me, it's just one of those names that immediately evokes that sense of scientific exploration. This watch has a storied history, a storied past. A few years ago, I went into discussing the vintage models and how these pieces have developed. But let's just say very simply, it's been rocky at best. This watch has struggled for a long time to find a clear, defining design language. We will explore that very briefly, but the most important thing to really discuss in this video is what is going to be the future of this watch. Is it relevant today? Is it a piece that deserves to remain in the collection, to be reinterpreted, or will it be discontinued? The most important references to understand the origin of the watch, the 6543 and the 6541. These pieces were introduced between 1954 and 1956. Now, the primary idea for these watches were to be used as instruments, as tools by those who worked in highly magnetic fields. And very much like the Daytona, a watch that failed to succeed for many years, these early references were in fact given out as prizes at events like racing events. I kid you not. I'm not biased with my favorite choice of watch or anything, but these gorgeous mid to late 1950s designs, they couldn't be given away. They were so ineffective and people didn't want them. I would say partly because of their price, partly because they were a bit over the top. And that had to do with things like the rotating bezel of the early model. Of course, we know inspired by the Turnograph. This didn't make a lot of sense. And I think for a while the Milgauss name was pushed into the background until 1960, where we saw the launch of the incredible 1019. A far simpler, we could say a more generic take on the oyster case format, but the beauty of this watch, it's all in the details. All of these small elements from an entirely unique handset, different batons, a second hand with a red arrowhead, an accentuated minute track with greater hash marks, the name Milgauss in bold red. And the reference 1019 was produced until the 80s. But what I find so fascinating is that between 1954 and 1980, you cannot find these references today. You would be so lucky to see even one 1019 in your life, let alone a 6543 or a 6541. These watches today fall into this category of being highly underrated because nobody knows about them. They don't have that typical name of Submariner, GMT, Daytona to really pursue. So the majority don't know about these watches, but those that do know the name and do know these vintage references will tell you straight up that you simply cannot find them and that they are probably without a doubt the rarest Rolex sports watches in the world today. First off, because I think they were made in such small batch numbers, and secondly, because you just don't hear about them. People don't talk about them, and they truly are enigmas. I really love them. And it's because we look at the sports watch range in general. They all have a theme. They all follow a very thematic development. With the Milgauss in the 50s, it was all cartoonish. It was a real character. By the time we got to the 60s, it was far more reserved. So without that foundation to work on, they could really go wild and get creative. And this makes for such a great modern development because by 1988, the Milgauss was discontinued and reintroduced again in 2007. And it's a collection that still lives on today. This family and the reference 116400 has a wide range of watches within the collection. From black dials to white dials to beige quarter accents, green glass, a turquoise sunburst dial, and of course the most whimsical, charming accent is that highlighted orange seconds hand that looks like a lightning bolt. Now it makes a lot of sense why the modern Milgauss won't appeal to the majority. It's a far less stoic design and approach compared to the rest of Rolex's current sports lineup. This modern collection manages to take the best of the 6541 and the 1019, marry them together and create a watch that has a sense of formality with its polished elements, as well as being something highly sports-oriented and something that'll make you smile every time you look at it. And that, I believe, is the winning formula to why I believe the Milgauss has managed to survive for so long. Not only does it have a completely different approach to the rest of Rolex's lineup, it has an awesome name that you just want to say over and over again, but it also offered such a unique point of difference with the inner cage that surrounded the movement and a story that backed it up. But the fact remains, a lot has changed between now and 2007. We don't have to worry very much about magnetism affecting our watches purely because of the technology that has developed over the last, decade and a half. So what does that mean then for the development of the Milgauss? Because as of right now, there's only one watch in their catalog, the 116400 GV Z Blue, that beautiful turquoise dial. I mean, it's a piece today that remains popular because of its point of difference with regards to its style, its design, its character, not so much about its properties and its performance. I mean, we look at it historically, that means a watch like this would be phased out. But I think there's a silver lining in this story, and that is the Air King. You see, the Air King is a watch in this category that never seemed to really find its footing either. And it got to a place quite recently where the Air King was using the Milgauss case and bracelet to carry its design forward. And just when we were talking about how the flame of the Air King was going to be extinguished, we see it reintroduced with a new case, new dial, new bracelet. It's a new watch. And judging by that development alone, I think the future spark, see what I did there, of the Milgauss might be quite bright. So now we get to the redesign portion of this video, the reinterpretation, and how I would want to see this watch further developed. But the first thing I want to do is to look at a very popular, a widely circulated design of a Milgauss that was brought out a few years ago by, I think, Monochrome watches. And it's an absolutely beautiful interpretation of how us as enthusiasts would want to see that clash of modern and vintage. And I think if pigs could fly and we had that depth of creative freedom, this is exactly how we would want to see the Milgauss. Strong ties to both the 6543 and the 1019. It's the kind of watch that I would buy in a heartbeat. But the biggest detractor and the reason why I don't think this watch would ever see the light of day is that rotating bezel. Simply put, it doesn't have a purpose in today's criteria, and it's a design that lasted for less than 2 years, and this was in the 1950s. The biggest issue is that it would confuse both the Submariner and the GMT collection, two watches that have always been defined by their rotating bezels. That said though, everything else about this watch is stunning and I think could be carried over. See, I would love the 1019 to be the mainstay. I would love that watch to be used as the chief inspiration, to look further back into that line and to create more of a literal reinterpretation of what that watch could look like today, but using the modern Air King case and bracelet. My ideal Milgauss would be one that's 39mm that uses the same dial off the Oyster Perpetual 39 that was discontinued a few years ago. Juxtaposed next to the current Oyster Perpetual collection that focuses on bright spot colors, I would want these to be stark, sterile, engineered. A white dial and a black dial. And of course using red as the accent color. On top of it, I would also want to include the current minute track that's used with the Milgauss collection. Now I would understand some would say this comes across as a painfully generic design, but I think it also equally screams a high form of professionalism. It's another white dial professional Rolex that I believe deserves to be in the collection. And like we have witnessed time and time again, simplicity is what stands the test of time. So the future of the Rolex Milgauss is up in the air, whether this watch will be discontinued or reinterpreted. As a casual observer, I would say it would be very disappointing for this watch to be discontinued because there's so much potential and opportunity to create something even more dynamic, more fun, more professional driven. With the Air King returning with a new case, a new design, a strange twist of fate might mean that the Milgauss for the first time borrows from it. With a name like Milgauss still being a recognizable property in Rolex's collection, we should also bear in mind that it's also outlived its purpose. Even though 1000 Gauss was its original calling card and this watch has far surpassed that, so have many others. The development of watch movements and their abilities to withstand magnetism has rendered this watch and its purpose kind of pointless. But isn't that the case with all mechanical watches today? Yeah, another watch in Rolex's family that has tons of potential and it's hard to know whether they will explore it or not. Every time I look at these pieces, I feel like it is the end of an era, that we will never see such dynamic and creative pieces again. You know, watches of the mid-2000s that threw caution to the wind and just went for it. Still, they're kind of fun, they have a cult following, and if they were reintroduced again, with the kinds of elements that we saw belonging to the 1019, they would be popular. So thank you very much for taking the time to watch this video. I'll see you in the next one.